You know who we are.
The most dangerous morning show.
Put some respect on it.
The Breakfast Club.
Yep, it's the world's most dangerous morning show, The Breakfast Club. Charlamagne the God, Angela Yee, DJ Envy had to bounce, but we have a great guest on this morning, a person I can't wait to have this conversation with. His name is Philip McHarris. He is a joint PhD candidate in sociology and African-American studies at Yale University, but more importantly, he is a supporter of Black Lives Matter, and he's been on the front lines in regards to having this conversation about defunding the police. Good morning, Philip.
Good morning. Good morning. It's good to be joined with y'all today.
Now, I guess we might as well get into it. Could you explain to me the whole concept of, and watch how I say this, divesting from policing and reinvesting funds into community resources and alternative safety and emergency response systems, commonly known as defunding the police? I didn't want to say the triggering term.
I like how you specified that. Yeah. So, defunding the police comes from, a broader strategy, like you mentioned, of invest, divest, where, divesting from systems of policing. But the strategy can be used for prisons, for other harmful systems and institutions as well. But really, it stems from this strategy of divesting from systems of policing and, reinvesting those funds into community resources, things that actually make communities safer. We know when people have safe housing, quality schools, jobs, and safe spaces to be, that actually increases safety in ways that, we know that policing does not. But we know that even if that happens, there might still be moments of conflict, violence, and harm. And so for that, it's alternative emergency response systems. This model where we have police, armed agents of the state responding to various situations, we know it's not actually leading people to be safer, and it's actively harming and killing, particularly Black people as well as other marginalized groups.
It always interests me to find out how people end up where they are. So Philip, how were you raised? Like, where did you grow up? And what has your experience been like, with the police? Because now you're at Yale. I just want to know how your parents, played an instrumental role in education for you growing up, what your environment was like.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, definitely, the education piece was always something important. And, also from my sisters who were involved in different, political, activist spaces and whatnot, that really helped to open my eyes up to a lot of the things that, I was experiencing as a young person. So I was born in the Bronx. That kind of was my early years. And then my mom ended up moving to Jersey. So I spent a lot of my older adolescence in Newark. My dad still lived in the Bronx, so I went back and forth. But so I went back and forth. I went to Benedict's, as I mentioned, and at first I wasn't focused on the school thing, and eventually it kind of became something I was focused on. And I went to undergrad at Boston College, and then started grad school at Yale. But the thing is a lot of times when people have these conversations, that one of the big critiques that people come back with is like, okay, well, you don't care about violence. You talking about defunding and divesting or abolishing the police. You don't care about all of the things going on. And, one of the things like I respond is like, growing up, I experienced the kinds of violence that oftentimes people are talking about, that I, want to have safety interventions and want, cycles of violence to stop. And so, just like as a story, just to kind of like shape it in terms of the education piece too, when I was a senior in high school, it was during the period of time applying to colleges, getting into college. And I had gotten into a situation. It was over like a kind of a he say, she say situation. It was in Newark. And long story short, this group of people from a different neighborhood tried to like jump me at Penn Station. And, I ended up running. I knew where they were from because my friend was from the area. And I ended up running. And as I'm running, I call my brother. I'm like, yo, people downtown trying to jump me. He's like, all right, I'm on my way. I stopped running for a second and kind of just like stopped, and they looking at me, I'm looking at them. They end up chasing me more because like I kind of just stopped running, and it got to a point where I had outran them, and I got a call on the phone. And I kid you not, well, I first got a notification. I looked at the notification and said that I had just gotten to college, like as I'm running. I get the next call, and the call is like, yo, what did you do? It's a target on your head in this hood. I'm like, what?
Wait, so you're running and checking your phone while you're running?
I'm running, and so I get a ping. It's like, okay, I look at my phone. I promise you, it's like gets to the
You're too distracted by your phone, Phil. There's no way in hell if I'm running for my life, a ping would make me check my phone.
I had outran him at the time, so I was like, and I had lived close to Penn Station, so I'm like looking at my phone, like, yo, what's going on? And I get a ping, and it's like, you get an email, you get into school, and then I'm looking, and I got a call. My homie called me like, yo, it's a target on your head. And I knew what that meant because I knew this area, and I knew it was a well-known like group that they was affiliated with. And long story short, I spent days like afraid and paranoid and like trying to figure out how to approach the situation. I ended up calling my cousin who was from a different area, but who was well-known and well-respected. And he was like, yo, I was locked up with some of the big homies in this area. I'm gonna go talk to him. And I'm gonna try to handle this diplomatically. He ends up going and he talks to the big homie of this group. And the big homie's like, yo, I didn't know that was your cousin. He's telling me good. And that was it. And the reason why I tell that story is that part of that whole situation, I never even thought to call the police. It was never even, my life could have been in danger. You know, I could have lost my life, but I never thought to call the police.
Why?
It just wasn't, it didn't even register because I never saw the police as like the protectors. I never saw the police as somebody like an entity that was going to protect me. And if you think about it in that situation, what would have happened if they did get caught in theory? If somebody did call the police?
And FYI, you would have probably been more of a target if you would have called the police.
Exactly. And so that's a part of that story. And then a couple months later, I went to college. Nobody knew what had just happened to me. I didn't get no trauma, support. I didn't get no counseling at the time. That I had to figure out how to deal with that. But the moral of the story, at least in that, is that there was somebody, because of their relationship, to happen to be my cousin, was able to navigate that situation in ways that the police would have never been able to. And imagine if we had whole systems and institutions dedicated to doing that kind of work as well as other kinds of work.
Do you think people are more against the term defunding the police rather than the action of it? Because when you actually hear what the action is, it makes so much sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think a part of it is that like invest, divest, like you said, is linked to a investing. It's not just about removing something in the negative sense. W.B. Du Bois, when he wrote Black Reconstruction, was very critical of projects of abolition of slavery, just in a negative sense, like doing away with, slavery. And so he came up with this concept of abolition democracy, that you have to create new life-affirming democratic systems and institutions in order to really, abolish unjust systems. And so I think when people sometimes hear defunding, they don't hear the reallocation. But in Chicago, they recently did a survey. It was about 38,000 people, and 87% of the people agree with divesting from policing and reallocating resources. And so this is a city where the mayor has said, our people want cops, and this is not a strategy. And and so it shows that a lot of it becomes how you frame it. If you frame it just as get rid of something, people are like, you trying to take away my safety and help, even if people don't believe in it. But if you say we want to actually create specialized teams, specialized responses, whether it's, domestic violence, respond to different kinds of harm, if it's a community violence, whatever it might be, imagine having specialized teams that can respond. You can call somebody, hey, something just happened. I just got robbed, right? Because right now the model is like police show up and, they might ask you what happened. They say, we'll try to look for the person. If you're somebody who calls the police, and then usually the clearance rate is non-existent. They usually don't end up finding the person. But what happens if you could respond? You could call somebody that's a trauma informed that could respond and say, hey, what happened? Do you need money? You just got robbed, right? We have this pool of funds that can restore you right now in this moment, to give you funds for what just happened. And, what does it look like to go through a process? If we do find out what happened, to go through a process to figure out what happened, why did this situation happen, and to transform the whole encounter to hopefully stop it from happening again. Because right now this model of just lock them up is not, creating safer communities.
Have any police departments, started the process of defunding the police? I know in New York, I think they stripped like $1 billion away or something like that. Yeah,
so New York, LA, historically, a couple years ago, there was a initiative in Milwaukee that was successful, Liberate MKE. Durham Beyond Policing was able to win a campaign. Austin, Berkeley, which is big, they decided to remove police from traffic safety. this idea that like a lot of these moments of violence start from police stopping people, and there's no reason why somebody with a gun with the license to murder somebody has to pull somebody over for a tail light. It doesn't even, it doesn't even make sense. And I shared this, with you before, Charlamagne, is like January I got pulled over as I was leaving Yale to go to Boston, because I was visiting some friends, and the state trooper pulls me over in the middle of Massachusetts, middle of the night, and he's like, yo, so what's going on? Where you going? I'm like, I just left school. I'm about to go visit some friends. It's like 10 o'clock. And I'm like, he's like, okay, so is this your car? Is this a rental? Like, where you coming from? Where you going? Like, why your license plate say X, Y, and Z? And I'm sitting there and I'm like, you pulled me over because you said that I got off of an exit a certain kind of way. He comes back to the car and he's like, hey, because of the way you were driving and because this is a drug corridor, I believe you're trafficking drugs up north and I want to search your car. Now I'm sitting there and I'm like, how did you even get to that conclusion? Like, I looked at him, I'm like, what? And he's sitting there looking at me and he starts talking and I'm looking at him bewildered, like what? And he's like, I'm asking you again, sir, can I search your car? And I'm looking at him, I just respond, no, because I'm like, I felt uncomfortable by it. And I'm like, I don't trust it. So you're going to put something in my car or something. He leaves, and in those moments, I'm thinking, I just told this cop that I'm not letting him search my car. He gonna come back and do something. Like this not gonna be the end of this. So I called my mom and my sisters. They don't, it was late. So I sent them a video, like, I don't know what's happening. I don't know what's about to happen, but I'm just letting you know that I love you. And like, I'm trying my best. And at that point, I thought that I don't know, that might've been, I didn't know what was gonna happen. I literally contemplated like, this might be the time where I die. And he comes back to the car and he's like, okay, I'm gonna just give you a warning. I'm like, what?
How do you go from being a drug trafficker to just getting a warning?
Right. He's like, I'm gonna give you a warning, and just drive carefully. And I'm looking at him, I'm like, wait. So now I'm recording him. I'm like, so wait, can you? I didn't let him know, but he might have known. But I'm like, can you tell me why? What's going on? He's like, oh, I'm not profiling you if that's what you think. And I'm sitting there, and I'm like,
just did.
He goes on for a little while and I'm like, you know what? I'm like, okay. He's like, all right, just drive safe. And I'm sitting and I'm like, I literally just thought I was gonna die because this cop said I got off of an exit. And when I told him I got off to get gas, he told me that he didn't believe me because he looked through the window and at my GPS and didn't see a stop for a gas station. And I'm like, yeah.
And this may be a stupid question. There's no Yale privilege in those moments, being that you're in the area, kind of, if you know what I mean?
I said it. I was like, I just left school and, I'm going to Boston. And his response was, your profession has nothing to do with it.
Wow.
That's what he said.
And that's not fair either anyway, just because if you don't go to Yale, then there's like, that's ridiculous.
And that's why I don't even like really saying that because I don't want to create, I try not to create a context where it's like, then if somebody doesn't have that privilege, then, they asked out. So, but
do what you got to do to survive, though, Phil.
No, and in that moment, he asked me where I just came from, and I just told him, and that was his response. And so that whole situation, I don't want a cop to be nicer to me. And for the most regards, he was being racist while being pretty nice, and that's how police are being trained, like verbal jujitsu, community policing, legitimacy, just make people feel listened to while he was doing something real racist. And so I don't want him to be a nice cop. I just don't want that interaction at all.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens if we do defund the police? Like what's and I've heard some people I don't know I can't remember the term. I guess it's abolitionists. That's what they call it.
Yeah, abolition.
What do they want to replace the police?
Well, all right. So I think the first thing is that, again, the approach to like poverty and inequality in this country has always been trying to police and imprison our way out of it. But this is what I was mentioning before. If people had safe schools, if people had housing, healthcare, employment, and actually like employment that pays a living wage and that gives people a sense of dignity. When all of those things are in place, and this we know from decades of social science research, if all of those things are in place, people, the rates of conflict and violence and harm dramatically reduce. It's just
a lot of less stress and anxiety for people.
Exactly. We know that poverty is mentally exhausting and taxing for people. We just know that all of these things contribute to the kinds of conflict and violence and harm that we see. But that doesn't mean that it's a utopic vision. Like if everybody's not poor, nothing will happen. And so, or if everybody has their basic needs met, nothing will happen. And so that's why this alternative emergency response systems is important. Like basically a community can sit down and say, okay, what does a response to every single kind of threat to someone's safety, or every single kind of conflict, every single kind, like different kinds of violence, how do we design responses to tend to the specifics of those situations? And it doesn't mean we have one person respond to everything. It means, okay, if folks are homeless, how do we have a response? So how do we create a context where people aren't homeless? Because that's not just, it's not natural or inherent. It's a product of certain political decisions. But how do we address that? If there's a, somebody's got robbed, if it's patriarchal violence, if it's, whether
mental health, because there's a lot of a high percentage of people who are homeless.
Exactly. Mental health. And we know that the statistics show that on average, people who have mental health illnesses are nearly 16 times more likely to be killed by police. And so basically it's not just like replace one, it's how do we develop a system where there's a number of different responses that can provide with the resources and tools to respond to specific situations, so that it's not about defunding or abolishing your ability to get help. It's actually about creating systems of safety, that can actually keep you safe and can actually, when the person shows up, you don't have to worry about that person killing you because you called them, to help you, right? And so, and a part of it is that when you look at the history of policing, this is not like an aberration or sort of just like just like a deviation. That policing in this country was designed as racial class control. In the South, it was as slave patrols. That was the first sort of in the 1700s, specifically in the Carolinas, it was the first organized entity of policing, right? That specifically it was raiding, quarters of enslaved people for weapons and contraband, dispersing people who were enslaved when they were gathered, and finding people who were enslaved when they ran away. And then in the North, really it emerged as a form of class and labor control. Capitalists were able to convince cities that it was in their best interest to develop these policing entities to protect their property. And when labor organizing was happening, it was responding to those instances where people were organizing against exploitative labor conditions. And so when you look at the histories of policing and then go throughout time, whether it's Jim Crow, whether it's the LAPD forming a SWAT entity in response to Black Panthers, and then really Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965 with the Law Enforcement Assistance Act begins this sort of federal investment in policing. And other reformers like August Vollmer and O.W. Wilson basically started to shift this idea that, like, okay, we need to try to reform the police. So this is over 100 years old. We need to try to reform, the police because they're corrupt and people don't trust them. And basically what you got is this, every time these moments where people were trying to reform or give police more resources, this issue became bigger and bigger, and police had more and more resources to control, and police people. And then, the Clinton crime bill, and we can go through history, but basically just what remains constant is that, reform efforts have largely driven and expanded police power as opposed to bringing about, safety. And really it's because the systems were designed for racial class control. And so in many ways it's doing what it was in many ways designed to do.
Yeah, I think trying to reform the police departments is like trying to reform a pit bull that you've been teaching to fight for years and years and years and years. Like there's no reform.
And people, right. And people say like, nah, like, y'all are being ridiculous. The idea that policing in this country can be reformed to something that is not violent and racist and classist after hundreds of years of police showing what they are, and that they're not tools of public safety in a broadly conceived sense, is more ridiculous than thinking that we should overhaul the system and design new approaches to safety and violence and harm.
Can I ask, if I give you a scenario, since we're talking about safety and violence, right? I want to hear how you feel like would be an ideal way to handle this, just to give people an example. Yeah. And this is something that really happens all the time. So let's just say the neighbors call the cops because they say that someone broke into the house next door. They see somebody that doesn't live there. They don't know who that person is, and they're nervous and scared. Can you please come and check it out? This really did just happen. So the police come, young Black men in the house, but they're supposed to be there.
Mm-hmm.
They're living in someone else's house. Maybe it's an Airbnb, whatever the situation is, they have permission to be there, but now they have to prove themselves. Now in your scenario with the safety intervention, what should happen if the neighbors call the police, the racist neighbors call the police because they feel like someone doesn't belong there? How would this be handled, just as an example?
Right, yeah. So again, I think a part of this is like creating the context where people are less likely to even think this is happening because people have their basic needs met. When people are not, impoverished, the idea that people are breaking into people's house, it decreases. But again, like you said, if it does happen, right, and there are like sort of like racist neighbors, there can be a response team that responds to situations that that can respond rapidly to the situation, that the focus is not around punishment and control and vengeance and showing up and you got a gun and you have the license to kill somebody and use it. But ideally, one is creating the context and increasing the capacity of neighborhood residents to be able to respond to situations, to say, like, if there's people in the community that can respond to say, like, what's going on, right? To like knock on the door, hey, like, I'm not afraid of you young Black people. And I'm just, I know that this neighborhood, I was just wondering, like, are y'all like, staying here for a little bit? What's going on? But if there needs to be a number called, there can be people who, within the community that are responding to the situation. Because what you described doesn't sound like somebody, the idea, the model that ended up happening probably caused more harm than it did anything else. And so I think the main thing is that what would it look like for a community to come together to say, okay, in these moments, if something is going on, how do we want to respond to the situation to make sure that nobody ends up dying as a result of just trying to see what's going on?
One of the most tone-deaf moments of the whole presidential campaign, Phil, and I want to know what you think about this, is after everything that happened this year, and they start talking to the presidential candidates, Joe Biden said he didn't believe in defunding the police, and actually he wanted to put $300 million into police departments.
Word.
What did you think when you heard that?
Yeah, I mean, so one, it didn't surprise me. Trump has been using like, the whole defund sort of response in the rhetoric of law and order in order to try to make Biden seem like, he doesn't care about safety and X, Y, and Z, which is a strategy that goes back in previous presidential elections, back to, Dukakis, and all the way back where conservatives, specifically presidents or presidential candidates, were using this rhetoric of law and order and crime in order to stoke fears, to get people basically, afraid. And then in response, in some ways, Democrats then said, nah, we're as tough, if not tougher than y'all. And then we see all of these, with Law Enforcement Assistance Act with Johnson, but then the Clinton crime bill was designed by Joe Biden, right? So that was the beginning. That was the largest expansion of police resources and power since the Law Enforcement Assistance Act. And so in many ways, Biden has been consistent that he's been consistent in expanding police power and in re-entrenching, police resources, and putting more through initiatives like, the Cops Grant Office, more police on the street. And so when it happened, of course, I was, it was a moment where there could have been, there was a moment to say like, we should reallocate these resources. But Biden has been advocating for the same kinds of reforms that re-entrench police power and make issues even more entrenched and bigger, for a long time. And so I think he was responding to, that law and order kind of rhetoric that he was afraid of alienating particular voters. And then also, I think that Biden has been consistent that he believes that throwing more money at, an inherently unjust system will somehow make it, become like non-racist and sort of a non-violent institution. But we know from history that's just not the case.
If you had to break it down for somebody simple and plain, if somebody said to you, why don't police departments actually need the big budgets that they have, what would you say?
One, well, when we look over history, in 1960, the United States spent $2 billion on policing. In 1980, it was $14.6 billion. In 2000, it was $67 billion. And by 2018, it was over $100 billion. And when you look at it, that rise in police expenditures is not correlated to reductions in indices of crime. And I use that because crime is a social construct, and much of it has to do with who's in power and race and class. But when you look at all these expansions in police funding, it hasn't led to the kinds of safety and communities that people want. If you go and look in the communities that have the biggest police budgets, it's not just like these communities are safer, and in many ways it creates these issues. And so a part of it is just that when police are getting all of these resources, it also stands in the way of other kinds of systems, other kinds of responses, other kinds of approaches that can actually keep people safe. It gets in the way of that, not only resources, but ideologically, because now people see the police and the criminal legal system as having a monopoly on the arbitration of public safety. When we know from decades of research that communities can achieve large sort of gains in public safety when they have the resources, when they trust each other, when they are willing to intervene in situations. And a part of that is having the resources and building up the capacity for a community to do that. And when
that money also go towards settling lawsuits.
Usually cities actually all of that money, usually it's a different fund. It's like a city fund because of qualified immunity doctrines and ways of approaching these. The city ends up taking on funds, so it does come from taxpayer money, but basically the police are getting these large police budgets, violating people, brutalizing people, and inevitably the city then is paying even more money to deal with the issues that we know that we can stop. The only way to stop it, encountering police violence, is to avoid the encounter altogether.
George Floyd Policing Act are the policing bill that Tim Scott presented. Have you looked over both of them?
Yeah, the Democratic bill.
Yeah, the Democratic bill, and then the one Tim Scott presented. Which one do you like?
The Breathe Act. Movement for Black Lives recently released the Breathe Act, and that is the actual bill that will begin to shift, both resources, but also begin to build up capacity. And it's, the Movement for Black Lives put out the policy platform years ago, and it builds on that in some ways. But it's the largest bill coming out of Black movement since the Civil Rights Movement, and that actually has the potential to really shift some things. And right now it's been the only bill presented that will actually sort of move us closer to safer communities that are free of police violence and cross reform.
Go ahead.
What do you think will happen if Donald Trump stays in office when it comes to policing?
He's been unapologetic, like in terms of expanding police power and also emboldening police, to act however they want, and knowing that the president is in line with that. And so in many ways, like it will be like what we see, but it's even more. We know like police unions across the country support Trump because he explicitly, even though Biden is still very pro-police, but Trump in his rhetoric and the way that he emboldens, it's very explicit in ways that empowers police even more. And so it's going to be more funding, more, resources at the federal level, which is what happened in recent months, where the Justice Department was sending out federal agents to local cities, and so I'm sure we'll see more of that, and basically just re-entrenching and expanding police power and using federal mechanisms and approaches to do that.
Yeah, and my problem with Biden in regards to that is just like, pick a side. The police already ain't rocking with you. None of the police unions have endorsed you. So why not just be on the side of the people?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's something that I've wondered. And I think a part of it, though, is I think that Biden really believes in some ways the things that he's saying. I mean, he's been saying this since the crime bill, Yeah. He's been saying it since the 90s. So in some ways, I think he really believes it. In other ways, I think that, this is a strategy of playing on fears that I think that, Biden is concerned will alienate certain people. The good thing in all of this is that a lot of these campaigns are happening at the local level, and a lot of these decisions get made by city councils and budgeting decisions at localized levels. And so the good thing is that regardless of who's in presidency, that these campaigns that have exploded all across the country, the work can continue even outside of the federal landscape being either one. So that's the good thing. And then people are going to keep pushing for things like the Breathe Act, which can be applied at the state and federal levels. But I think the work will continue.
Have you seen any cities where the police departments you feel are effective or the intervention systems are effective?
No, no, because the policing wasn't created for public safety, and so when you look at it, it always has these costs associated with it, regardless, and also it actively harms certain communities, and it doesn't work in the way that people conceive of it. Too. Again, when we look at clearance raids, and when you look at what police do, less than, in the New York Times did a report, and they showed that less than 4% of the time most police departments were even responding to anything involving violence. Less than 5% of arrests in this country are for anything involving violence. And I'm not saying that should be the answer to those situations either, but what we see is that police don't do what people conceive of them to do. And a part of that is, socialization and propaganda and, basically all of the things that teach people what police do. But, we know that what police do is actually not lined up. And Camden is an example of this, where people started saying, oh, well, they defunded and abolished. That is not an example. They just took, for austerity measures and scaled it up at the metro level, basically just expanded it and like sort of implemented surveillance tools. But it's like policing by any other name. Like the tools, the strategy, the approach is centered around punishment and control and vengeance. And, that's not the answer to creating safer and accountable communities, which is why, things like restorative justice, transformative justice, and the alternative response systems that are emerging are really pathways forward, as opposed to trying to change these systems that have shown, what they are.
Yeah, I'm really trying to figure out why politicians are so scared of police and police unions. Like I don't get it. Are they that big of a voting block? Like, what is it?
They powerful, bro. They're powerful. And in part because they've made them, politicians have made police powerful. And then in turn, now they have these large police unions are powerful. They're organized bodies that, that people that in politicians are afraid of what happens, because they actively organize against, people who try to, transform these systems, or politicians who are, not pro them or not pro expanding police power. And so part of this is like, but it is also playing into fears, because for decades, people have been told police are the stewards of public safety. So now it's so entrenched in people's minds. It's such a powerful idea in people's minds that if you come out and say, you know what, actually, I think X, Y, and Z, people take that and say, you don't care about safety, because these systems have so thoroughly, socialized and dominated people's minds that people equate it like that, this idea that policing has always existed and it's for public safety. And so then they play into that and say, well, you don't care about safety. You want these communities to just go into disarray. And it's a powerful, tactic. And it works because of that association is so tightly linked. Even when it's communities where people don't trust the police, they don't believe in the police. But even in those communities, if you say, we're just going to get rid of the police, sometimes people are like, wait. Because you've been told your whole life, even if it doesn't make sense to you, that is the only line, that's the only safety, intervention that you have. When we know we can create new systems, and if policing, it's a government, entity, and so if it's not working in the spirit and the nature for the people, then we should be able to abolish it and build new systems.
Phil, do you feel worthy of being named as one of the 100 most influential African Americans in 2020 for the work that you've done? Congratulations.
I appreciate that. I mean, that was definitely, it hit me when I saw it, and it was a list of a bunch of dope people, and so I'm appreciative that of the root, of course, for acknowledging the work. And it's work that I first got involved in this work in like 2015, coming out of Ferguson and the murder of Michael Brown, and so it's something that I've been intent on, and it's something from my own life. Literally when I'm driving around, it's like it's not just like abstract, like, oh, it's like I might get pulled over after I leave this, and what I'm saying, like in something unnecessary might happen. So a part of it is just like it's something that I'm doing for me, for my people, and it's always dope to get recognized in that way. But the focus is on the work, of course.
How can people get more information too, just in case they want to look up more information on you?
Sure. So Kaepernick actually, Colin Kaepernick actually
I was just about to ask you that, because I saw him pin that op-ed, and I was wondering, did he reach out there?
Yeah, so he dropped this through his publishing company. It's a series of 30 essays around abolition, and it's called Abolition for the People. And so I think that's a really good resource. It breaks it down. A lot of dope people on that. 8 to Abolition is a really great resource. the Breathe Act. I suggest everybody read Movement for Black Lives, Breathe Act. That can be applicated at the state and federal levels. And there's a bunch of different, if you just Google abolition, study guides, a bunch will come up. Because for me, it took me years for it to click. And so I understand why, for me, when I first heard it, I'm like, 2015, I'm like, all right, I don't rock with the police, but I don't get it, and it took me maybe 4 or 5 years for it to really click, okay, I see it now. And so a part of that has been, being in a community where other people learn about it, reading and studying and just having, these kinds of conversations to really dig into it and figure out, what it is and what it's not.
Well, Phil, salute to you, man. How many more credits you need? I don't know how it works at Yale. Is it credits or what is it?
So I'm finishing my dissertation right now. So I'm defending in March, and this is my last year, and then I'm going on postdocs, assistant professor positions.
What made a pro-Black brother like you go to an Ivy League school as opposed to an HBCU?
I mean, when I was applying the resources, the funding, the people at the institution, the program, and it ended up just making it. But I was actually, for undergrad, it was between Boston College and Morehouse. That was the other option. And, in some ways, I think people were pushing me in ways that I didn't realize at the time to go to BC. Now I'm looking back, and at the time I was looking, I'm like, okay, I went to my high school, St. Benedict's. It was all boys. It was predominantly Black. I'm like, so this is basically like St. Benedict's volume 2 if I go to Morehouse right now. So I'm like, and a lot of it was money though. Boston College ended up giving me a kind of scholarship that I was like, okay, this is something I don't have to take out a lot of loans and ended up just going in that direction. So, I mean, I thought about transferring now, I'm like, all right, I might have to go but I ended up just building a community, wherever I was at.
Do you view, and this is my last question, do you view your success at Yale as like an act of protest against the limits that society tries to put on Black men?
I mean, in some ways, those institutions weren't made for Black people, and especially, Black people who are pushing back against it. But it's also, in many ways, it's I recognize that it's a privilege also that I received from being a part of these institutions. But, of course, when you're in spaces where it wasn't meant for you, find ways to be subversive and to push boundaries. And so, that's what I've tried to do, is not to just be, complacent with, okay, I'm in these spaces, and that in and of itself is an act of protest, but how do I, shift conversations? How do I move things? How do I move resources? How do I use all of this in the benefit of, of my people?
How does New Haven treat the Yale students, the residents?
I mean, it's wherever you have, Ivy elite universities, well-researched universities in the middle of Black or predominantly Black cities, there's always this relationship that, is designed basically to protect, quote unquote, the students from people, in this context, Black people in the neighborhood. So there's a long history of police and, in contentious relationships in engaging in violence towards Black communities. And there's an organization, Black Students for Disarmament at Yale. That's really dope. That's launched the Invest Divest campaign at Yale to dismantle the Yale Police Department and reallocate resources to the community and build and design other kinds of and more imaginative and creative approaches to public safety.
Tell them how to contact you, Phil.
Philip V. McHarris, PhilipMCHARIS on all social media. Yeah.
Well, you are appreciated, King, man. Congratulations again on making that list, man. You up there with Beyonce, and Issa Rae. Okay. So congrats to you, King.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate y'all. Thank you.
All right, Black man. Peace.